Hello everyone and welcome once again to another Games Confetti Industry Week 2021 event. This afternoon's event is one of the highlights for me. I've been working closely with Warlord Games to organise a Warlord takeover for today, and we've managed to get two of the two legendary games designers to come and do a talk for us this afternoon. So I'm really pleased to welcome Alessio Cavatore and Andy Chambers, who are going to be talking about their career as games designers and also about the work that they've done with Warlord Games. So once again, as usual, if you can refrain from using the chat function during the talk itself, that would be really helpful. And use the Q&A function to ask questions that we'll get to at the end of the session. So what's going to happen with this one is slightly different to the other talks. We've got two talks. So we've got Alessio doing his talk first, then Andy's going to do a talk, and then we're going to do a Q&A with both of them at the end. So remember to load up those questions into the Q&A section during the talk, and then we'll get to them at the end. I hope you enjoy today's session, and I'm really a massive thank you to Andy and Alessio for giving up their time to take part in the event today. And this is our 15th Confetti Industry Week, and it's probably the strangest one so far because of this virtual element, where everybody's sort of like a disembodied head on a screen. But it's kind of cool as well because we're doing really cool things like this where we've got two people in the same talk, and it's very exciting for us. Don't forget, there are still some events left. We've got tomorrow's events to look forward to. You can still book in on those, IW confetti.ac.uk. And remember, when you do book in, that you need to book in with your Confetti email address or your NTU email address. If you book in with your normal personal email address, you probably will get filtered out and you won't be able to access the event. Also, don't forget, as part of the Industry Week 2021, we're running a competition where you can win some really cool prizes. And all you have to do is post on Instagram or Twitter with the hashtag IW21. And share your experience of Industry Week. And remember to try and be a little bit creative with that. Don't just post a screenshot. Try and think about how you can frame it, maybe with some relevant things for the talk. So today's talk with Warlord Games, loads of opportunities to do cool stuff. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alessio, who's going to do the first part of the talk. Hey, Alessio.
Hi. Thank you for having us. So you want us to talk about slightly quickly our career and then going to the Warlord Games angle of things?
That would be great, yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I started my career as a games designer at Games Workshop, where I met Andy. He was already there. He was already a legend when I was there. You know, I started playing the game, reading his books, his Skaven book, and it was what made me want to play Warhammer. And so I got there, did my ropes, and was a translator, and then finally as a game developer. And yeah, I worked at Games Workshop for 15 years, designing Warhammer, 40,000, 40K, and Lord of the Rings, all kind of the three main. I worked on all three of them. And 2010 is when I finished my career at Games Workshop and started River Horse, which is my own company. And we do consultancies, game consultancies for other companies like Warlord Games, and we produce our own product as well. So that's me and my company. Warlord Games, since the very beginning of the existence of River Horse, in fact, probably that Bolt Action was the first game that I did as a service through River Horse, and Warlord were my first customer. Warlord and Mantic, I don't quite remember exactly which one was first, but at the same time, roughly, after leaving Games Workshop, we started to work on. I started to work on Bolt Action because at the time it was only me in River Horse. So I wanted to talk about the development of Bolt Action, so a big war game. And to do so, I thought I would use the presentation that I ran at Confetti a few years ago, which was a generic presentation about design in the analog games, not video games. I think Andy is more suitable if you want to talk about video games. Definitely more experienced. But if this presentation was about analog games, as in non-digital games, like board games, war games, card games, particularly with an eye of designing them for a third party, designing them for, in this case, I was hired by a different company to write it for them. And But of course, this works even if you're an in-house designer, because then your customer is your boss, whoever is your boss. So you're still, in any case, you're designing for a customer. There is somebody that would direct and get the product that you're designing. So let's see if this sharing feature works. I'll start with having a quick look at the presentation. So let me share screen. Click and click. You should be seeing the screen. Is that correct?
Yep, that's working.
Good.
Yep.
Right. So I'll make it into a proper presentation. Click. There we go. So this should be. So this was indeed the presentation that I did a few years ago at Confetti in an industry week. And let's talk about it from a bolt action, designing bolt action point of view. So we are adapting it to the task that I did for Warlord Games, with Warlord Games. So the first bit, the most important bit probably, is understanding what is required of you. I found that often a customer, your boss, or the company don't exactly know what they want. They don't really know exactly what the project they started needs to be at the end, because obviously some also maybe different people in the same organization would have a different idea of what they want. So a very, very, very important process you have to go through is making sure that everybody's on board, everybody agrees what they want. Because you don't want to go do a lot of work and then find out that that guy and that boss over there or that customer over there actually had something different in mind, and you're going completely in a different direction. So the briefing phase. The briefing phase is, as I always say, a million questions. Is basically asking all the details in general of the type of game that you are designing. So again, in the case of a bolt action war game, the question would have been, and I remember going to the pub with the top bosses of Warlord, so with John Stallard, Rick Priestley, Paul Sawyer, and we were debating and talking at length of what the game that we were going to design was going to be like. So how many players? 2 players. How big a playing surface? How many models per player? What type of models? Is it all infantry? Does it need to have vehicles? And what scale? So that is a huge amount of what you're trying to make sure that in everybody's head they're seeing the same picture. They're seeing the same picture of what the final thing needs to be like. And it's important to ask all of these questions, and I would advise any designer to get this all in writing at the end. After this is all abstract, these conversations, capture them in writing, just bullet point. You don't need to write a lot, but bullet points of what the objective is. Share them with the team, all the key stakeholders, and go, right, this is what we're doing. Yes, sign here. And then, once you have that, you have an objective, you have a shared objective, you have something that can be changed, but with agreement from, the stakeholders, and something that later on, if somebody says, oh, no, I thought you were going to put cards in this game, and you go, no, never talk about cards. Look at the brief. There is no mentioning of cards. It was dice and models, and a measuring stick. There is no cards. So important, a very important thing to understand what you're doing. Everybody on board, record it for future reference. And let's see if I can get to the next slide. Yes, success. At this point, there is the phase that you call game design or high-level game design, when basically what you do is you think about the brief, you think about how to fulfill the brief, and you design a skeleton of bullet points. Like you answer the questions in the brief. You go, right, how would I answer this question? How would I answer this question? And you kind of imagine, you do the high-level design of what the game is going to be like. With that in hand, with a very brief skeleton shorthand version of the rules, you get on a table, in the case, again, with bolt action, and you play it. It's vital. It's a very important thing. Do not just stay abstract and start writing. That will, again, if you want to optimize the process and do, not as little work and time as fast, basically finish the project as fast as possible, which is in everybody's interest. Test it, play it, try ideas, play it before putting anything in longhand, any writing. Test it with a key people, and make sure they are happy with what they have. So again, share, play with them, engage, something you're happy with and something they are happy with. Once everybody's on board with that, so when you're, when you have fulfilled, you think you fulfilled all the bits of the brief that you need to fulfill for the product, that's when you start actual writing. That's when you start the process of longhand writing the rules. So you're imagining this, the output of all of this has to be a manuscript, has to be a fully written set of rules, and maybe army lists to go with it. And that takes time, about a month of pure writing, I would say, depending on the product. I mean, if it's a smaller product, it will take less. But anyway, it's a long moment of writing, where you tend to focus on what you've done and try not to be distracted by other things. So seclude yourself somewhere, hide yourself somewhere, write it all down. And then you have the first version. The first version of the rules, we'll say the alpha version of the rules. That's the written manuscript of the rules, that follows a skeleton that fulfills the brief. Once that first draft is approved and everybody's happy with it, then there's the second section. So we go from the game design to the game's development, which are different phases, and it's important to distinguish them. The development in this case would be basically you take the first version, the alpha version, and if you, sorry, I see you waving. You're not waving. You don't, right? Okay, good. Okay, I continue. So you have the alpha version. You start implementing a sequence of testing and successive versions. So you go, I'll test the system. I played probably the army lists. In this case, in the case of Bolt Action, it was the core army list that we wanted to include in the rule book. See if I can remember. So we had the American, US Army, the German Army, the Soviet Army, the British Army, and the Japanese. No, the Japanese were not in the first edition of Bolt Action. They went into the second. So these were the armies that we included in the rulebook, at least a short version of those armies, with the intent later of doing books. But so test the core armies, the core units, and play extensively. Resist the temptation to make changes as you go. So resist the temptation to change the version, the alpha version, constantly as you play, because that is really asking for trouble. What you want is stick to the version as it is, play it as written for a period. Decide how long the period is, obviously a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, depending on how much time you have and manpower. Play, make notes. At some point, then stop playing and say, okay, we collected this many notes on alpha version. Implement all the changes, discuss the changes, implement the improvement, changes, tweaks, etc. Write the beta version. A new version, label it differently, 1.2, 1.3, or 2, whatever you want to call it, alpha, beta, gamma, whatever. Create a new version and start again. Play test, try again. Again, don't change the version, just make notes. Once you're done, stop playing, input tweaks and corrections, change the version to version 3, whatever, and start again. Now, how many times should you repeat this process before you go write it? Let's say that's the thing we're going to publish. The answer is, as long as you have time, resources, manpower, the luxury of iteration of this process as much as possible, because obviously the more times you do it, the more finished the product you'll end up with. So again, for Bolt Action, we did this quite a lot. Obviously, initially you do it internally with a few people that are, normally belong to the same organization, so you trust that have skilled in this particular field of testing and playing and developing games. And then slowly, and depending on how public you are with this development, then you probably try to bring in external people and try to expand the group that gives you feedback on the versions and on the testing. repeat as many times as possible until your manager, the boss, the customer is going to go, stop. We need to publish this. At this point, when basically you've reached the last version, the version that is going to be published, then you do the finishing touches to the manuscript. And we're still in the manuscript, we are not in the laid out version yet. At this stage, you would do the spell checking and the proofreading. So you would just make sure that the thing reads correctly and there are no typos, as few typos as possible. One important thing is the header priority, because when you write a manuscript, and this is where I will get out of this presentation, what could possibly go wrong, and give you a view of, for example, a manuscript, a finished manuscript of a bolt action rule book, in this case, will look something like that. So if effectively you're looking at a Word document, and in this level of thing, when you're handing it out, handing it over to be laid out, what's really, really important is header priority. So what I'm looking at here is, okay, that header there, this header here, they're clearly different. So kind of going, I want, when this is laid out, the graphic person that will create headers to represent this level of seniority, because obviously some rules belong within another higher level of paragraph. This is about troop quality, and within the troop quality, you have the NCOs, suppression markers, etc. Then you have another paragraph which is at the same level as that. So with the header priority of your manuscript, you're actually starting to give information to the person that is doing the layout, which is a very, very important thing. Because obviously from this that you're looking at, you will get to something like this. So what you have here is the finished laid out rulebook. So you have to go from that manuscript to this. And obviously that needs inserting pictures, diagrams, and all the graphic elements. And that header priority that you were putting in the thing needs to be respected. So, everything here has a logic. Let's go to the more rulesy part. For example, okay, troop quality and morale, squad leaders, that was called NCO, if you remember. So that subheader being part of that. So all these subheaders being part of that. And the way you do it is you define, maybe in the Word document, you put header 1, header 2, header 3, and then you try to respect the same title, the same header. So you would call something that was called header 1 in the Word document is called header 1 in this, which is normally an InDesign file. And that's a complex process, a process that will surely go wrong at some stage and requires a lot of paying a lot of attention to detail. One thing that takes, again, a lot of effort is diagrams. So things like this thing here that you see there, or more complex diagrams like this. What I've done is I went and dug out an old folder, which is where I had submitted the diagrams to Warlord when they made these diagrams. So obviously what I did is design beautifully hand-drawn diagrams like that. And so this is me, There's terrain diagrams, and then you go, all right, so that, as you see there, is a rendition of that. Obviously, in this case, there's a tank. Probably there was one for infantry. Let's see. That's another one, which is probably, ended up being that one. So you can see these things normally require a lot of iterations again, because you do it, and then depending on the graphic solution, this is a relatively simple solution because it's graphics with top-down view. In some other cases, people will use photographic diagrams, taking shots of miniatures, which look beautiful, but normally are really difficult to make sure they actually convey the right feeling. And putting arrows on diagrams or on photographs is quite difficult. So there's a lot of work, as you can appreciate, going from your manuscript to a finished rulebook with all this, commissioning the artwork, designing what the top secret, what the box out looks like in this case. So lots of information, lots of work to go together. Let's try to go back to the presentation by going to PowerPoint. Okay, and present. So I was saying, add priority, diagram sketches with captions, and give everything to the layout person. Now, it's important. If ideally you want to sit next to the diagram person so that you can point at things and show them things and give them examples and interact. And in the case of Bolt Action, was more complicated because the layout was done by Osprey, which are not based in Nottingham, so there was trips to the place where people were laying it out. So it was a bit more complicated when there's different companies working together into this thing. But eventually sending things back and forth, you get where you want, or as close as possible. Let's see. When you get the laid out version, indeed, you have to check everything, the things you have highlighted before, and make sure that they're all there. As you can see in this page, in this slide, at the end, probably you would go, the last thing you do is page references, where you go, when some of the rules say, see page 37, which obviously up to that point, you didn't have a clue where page 37 was, what page was that on. So you have to go and find all the pages and make sure that all the references are correct. And decide whether you want an index in there. So you would have to compile terms and pages, page references and numbers, and create that tool, which is useful, but obviously it's something you can only do at the very end, once the book is effectively laid out, because the moment you move pages around, you would undo all of that work. And third development, can continue on laid out version. Yeah, so once you have a laid out version, of course, in theory, if this doesn't have to be released tomorrow, you can still work and do playtesting, developing, but I would definitely recommend at this stage, don't make any major changes, don't make any substantial changes, just limit yourself to minor, very minor tweaks, point values maybe, of troops. So you go for the more little details of the troops. Basically, when it comes only to change a number or two, it's fine, because you're not affecting the layout of the book. You cannot go, oh, I think I want to the entire shooting section to work differently. That's when you start to go, no. If you have a great idea this late down the line, I suggest that probably the best thing you can do is write it down, make a note, save it for the next edition of the game, or another game indeed. So just don't wedge things in at the last minute, because that's going to break things. Such a big rulebook system is sophisticated, full of interacting links of relationship between rules. If you change something here, then it ripples for the entire manuscript and the system, and you're going to break things really badly. So no major changes. Then the book gets published eventually in the world, and you go, wow, it's out. Oh, there's a typo. Oh, there's a rule that, oh, we forgot to change that bit. Oh, we changed it in this section of the book, but we didn't change it in this section of the book. It always happens. Such a big organic system with lots of people working on it, with the process of changing from manuscript to laid out version. Things like this will happen. They always happen in my experience. And then you have to learn how to handle erratas, FAQs. So basically support your game when it's in the market by listening to the community, listening to the feedback, engaging, playing games. I go to tournaments often to get that feedback. And answer the questions, make errata. The important discipline that I find in this is to always resist the temptation of changing the rules using the errata. The errata are not there to change the rules. To think, oh, actually, I could improve the rules by making this change, and the game will work better. That's not what the errata are for. The next edition is for that. The erratas are to change things that are actually wrong, conflicting, creating issues on gameplay, as in literally whether the rules are not clear or not, or contradictory or wrong completely. If you start to make changes for errata, you're creating a different game that exists in the same space as the game. The person that doesn't have the errata, the latest errata, doesn't actually play the game. So it becomes a nightmare of versions, and basically it can put people off from your product. So minimal errata, just to deal with issues that, serious issues. Errata, which are more formal, more cozy, friendly, chatty things are called FAQs, or question and answers, where we're just chatting about the rules and explaining some of the intent, but don't change the game. Make notes. Next version, next edition is where you make the changes that you want to make. Right, this is the last slide, and I was trying to get through this within the time. What is the most important thing? So obviously, if we were in person, I would ask this question in person. But maybe let me get out of the presenting mode. What is the most important thing within all of this huge process? And now I've gone out of presenting, I believe. Please nod if that's the case. Good. Again, yep. Fantastic. So yeah, what can we ask people what they think is the most important thing throughout all of this? We cannot ask. We can. I cannot hear you.
Sorry, yes, you can. Sorry.
Okay, right. Yes. Yeah, there was something that actually distracted me a few times. I was like, I saw you speaking, but I couldn't hear what you were saying. So I was like, is he talking to me? I'm not sure.
Sorry, it was the text asked me a question.
Right, because you see me there going, huh? I could do the Al Pacino impression. Are you talking to me? Are you talking to me?
Amazing.
Anyway, so yeah, what is the most important thing? I don't know if anybody wants to try to answer that, or if you want to try. To
we've got that. Josiah says, "Don't focus on one particular asset too much." He thinks that
is important. I wouldn't have thought well, because what is the most important thing is clearly depending on the person. But I think that's not what I had in mind, and I tried to drop a few hints there through the presentation. But
anybody else wants to write in the chat? That would be good. The player is the most important thing. Ooh.
That's a philosophically very valid point. Yes, you're designing a game that, well, often you design a game that you would enjoy to play. That's normally a good milestone but on the other hand, you must be aware that there's very different players out there. The problem with the player is that there's not one player. There are lots of different players with very different taste out there. So there's the player that likes a very narrative game, almost role play. It doesn't really matter who wins, as long as we have a cool story and something really exciting happens, I'm happy. Doesn't really matter winning, losing, etc. And on the other end, there's the tournament power player that goes, no, what's good in life is crush your enemies and listen to the lamentation of their women. I don't care about fun. I care about crushing people. That's my fun. So difficult to accommodate for everybody in this case, but there's more answers?
Yeah, it's keep things simple and later on make things more advanced if you like, is from Ethan.
Keeping things simple is my mantra. The philosophy of River Horse is sophistication through simplicity. Sophistication through simplicity. Simplicity is difficult, which is funny. Is that Mark Twain quote of, I wanted to write you a brief letter, but I had no time, so I wrote you a long letter. Which is very true. Simplicity is very difficult. The ideal, the quest of the game designer, at least in my personal opinion, is trying to make the rules disappear. So you're not thinking about the rules. You're thinking about the strategy, the game, the story in the game, not the rules. The rules shouldn't be there in your brain at all. Example, chess. When you play chess, you're not thinking about the rules, are you? You're thinking about what to do with your pieces, because the rules are obviously so simple that you know them. So that's the ideal place to be, where the rules disappear in the background. Obviously, war games are far more complicated beasts, so sometimes you can't do that. But again, I had another. When I asked the most important thing, I was thinking about the most important thing when you're doing this as a job, as a profession. You're trying to deliver a product to a brief for a customer.
Just to reassure Andy, Andy's panicking that we've jumped into the Q&A. It's okay, Andy, we haven't jumped into the Q&A. It's just an interactive part of Alessio's presentation. Yes, sorry. He's just raised the bar significantly.
Well, I figured that asking a question to the audience helps not to make them fall asleep.
This is the virtual equivalent of the mic going out into the audience for feedback, yeah. So I've got another one from Lewis. A more personal answer would be that you've created something that you're proud of, or something that you want to show off to the world, and that's the reason that you do things.
There's the other reason that you do things in the real world is, of course, so that your customer is happy and he pays you, or rather, it keeps you employed if you're an employee. So the idea here, because again, I'm approaching this from a professional, I'm designing this for somebody. The answer that I was thinking about was communication. The most important thing is at all points in this process, keep your customer or your manager, if that's your customer, engaged. talk to them all the time, show them stuff, show them progress, ask their opinion, talk to them. Because I think very often what you can do is work in isolation, because maybe you're a bit precious about what you're doing. You kind of, oh, I don't want to reveal now. Oh, I'm not so confident. You know, they might not like it. Oh, so I'll keep it here. And then for a while, you don't show it to them. And then you realize that you've done 3 weeks of work in a direction that if you just had an honest conversation and saying, you know, I'm not sure about, should I do this or that bit, you know, and ask other people for feedback. A lot of the, sometimes your customers are very, very experienced people, you know, like in the case of Warlord, again, I had the benefit that I could go to Rick Priestley, you know, a guru of game design, and go, Rick, you know, I was thinking, you know, this issue here, we could do this or we could do that. What do you think? And, you know, bolt action, one big thing was one of the key cores of the brief was how to make create a something, a gizmo, something that was going to be identified with the game, synonym of the game, the defining element of the game. And how to fulfill that bit of the brief was challenging the idea of, oh, shall we try a different type of base with soldiers on, that something that's never been tried? Shall we try a different tape measure, a template, something that becomes, you know, this thing is bolt action? And eventually that led to the dice, to the action dice. Basically, the order dice was literally the answer to, okay, I went, okay, I need, because it's alternating activations, something that drives the activation and marks the unit that are activated, and becomes a thing that is typical and only of this game, and therefore it shows you, as well as activating, it also shows you which order they have received. So it does a lot of jobs, and is the win you draw to activate. So yeah, that was, you know, talk to people a lot. Talk to people. That was my point. Is don't isolate yourself. You know, I mean, that week when you're writing, yes. After you talk to people a lot, and after that, talk to people a lot, all the time. Very important. Communicate. And again, I don't know what we're doing for time. I didn't want to. I don't know whether I split up too much or not enough.
You're okay. Yeah, you've got a little bit longer if you want to do a little bit more, and then Andy can jump on. It's totally up to you, Alessio. If Andy's ready, we can jump him in now and parachute him in behind enemy lines.
It's because I realized that unfortunately the timer on this started counting when we were doing the setup, so I have no idea how long I've actually talked for.
You're on about 40 minutes so far. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, it'll be just about half an hour actually, won't it? Yeah, because we started about 5.
That thing was the thing that threw me. But I mean, if rightly so, if Andy's watching them, maybe we can leave the interactive part more to the end, the FAQs, and so happy to say that basically after Bolt Action was a success, it is still a very successful game. I mean, I'm told it's probably the most played war game after the Games Workshop ones, of course. So that's a fairly thing good to be proud of, and basically after the first edition, we did the second edition. So the only thing that I can add is there's a big element of design which is going from first edition to second edition. Just I'll spend a few minutes to talk about that, and then we can switch, I guess.
Yeah.
So the second edition is where you input all of those changes that I was talking about. So, you know, all the things that you decided resisted doing during the life of the first edition of the game, and 3, 4, 5 years later, you go right. New edition. And new edition comes about because obviously commercial reasons. You want to refresh your range, you want to entice new people to come into the game, you want to keep the game fresh by throwing a new challenge to the existing players and just slightly changing the way the game plays, improving it if there are bits areas that you think needs improving. So all of that, and hopefully it's a good chance to recruit new people, create enthusiasm. It's also a good chance of breaking something that works well. So it's a nerve-wracking moment. You have to be careful. If your game is successful, say Bolt Action first edition, you go, ooh, let's not change it too much, right? Because people seem to like it mostly. So there you go, second edition, and a lot of that process we described before. Basically, is the difference is you start from an existing manuscript. You do a log of changes. You go, right, I made the following changes. You have to track what those changes do to the first edition to turn it into the second edition. And the big decision is whether to keep all the other books that are out there, because obviously the next edition would change the rule book, but all the other books are still out there. And the question is, do I want those books to be valid still? So compatible, therefore the amount of changes you can make are limited, because otherwise you break all of the other books. Or you go, no, this is a big one. Basically all the other books are now redundant. You have to start from scratch, which, for example, for Bolt Action, definitely the decision, second edition was no. The books are still perfectly compatible, and therefore the amount of changes was less than if you change everything, because you need to keep the other books still valid. So that's the nerve-wracking moment when you go from first edition to second edition and future editions, and how often you do that is a tough decision for any company to make.
Is that led by players, or is that more of a business-led decision?
Players may influence that, but of course the players will influence that. If you have, if after 1 year that the game is out, you have a huge audience screaming, "This game is broken, doesn't work," or nobody buys it, etc., then of course you have a very strong feedback that you need to do something about it. If the game is going well, on the other end, there's a very strong case for not doing it at all, because you're kind of going, why risk it? If you're selling well. And the answer is always, there's always a part of your audience which is unhappy with some of the parts of your game. I mean, obviously, we know if people have different opinions, and there are elements that surely some people are not happy about. The designers themselves, myself, can go, I don't like how machine guns work in this particular. So you have some elements of the designer having some bits that they're not too happy with, the community giving you feedback about elements of the game that they would think it needs improving. Ultimately, unless there is a disaster in your hand, ultimately it is a commercial decision that the company will make at some point. But it's not an easy decision, because it's that risk versus reward consideration that you don't want to kill the golden goose, right? So
now, before Andy comes, we have got a question right at the beginning in the chat that was directed at you, which might be better for you to answer this now rather than answer it in the Q&A later on, because it is more specifically about your experience. So it's a fairly well-known fact that you are also a film star as well as a games designer. And one of the students, who I'm not sure if they might be a media student actually, and unfortunately it's scrolled up, I can't see who it was now, unless we can scroll that down and I can name
maybe it was Andy, teasing me.
Michael asked about your experience as being part of the filming of the Battle of Pelennor Fields in Lord of the Rings. We have a great expense here, got the text to Google a picture of you in your costume. There it is.
I'm the tall one.
You are the tall one, yeah. It's a fantastic picture, that, as well. I just love the Mumak in the background that's been downed by you Valiant 4, I think, as well.
Of course.
Do you want to explain who the other people are in the picture as well, just in case people aren't aware?
It's quite funny. Right, I wasn't expecting this to pop up in this context, but yes, sure, of course, I'm happy to talk about that. So in the picture, you can see myself, the giant the Rider of Rohan there, and the three normal-sized Rider of Rohan, which are in order from me, moving away from me. The first one is Alan Perry, one of the two Perry twins, the famous miniature designers. Then Brian Nelson, again, a figure designer. At the time, we were all working for Games Workshop. And finally, Michael Perry, which came quite handy because having lost an arm, he was very handy having like axes chopping for his arm, etc. So yes, we were filming a pickup scene for the Return of the King there. Yes, and very lucky, very cool experience, I have to say. Yes.
Fantastic. Did it just come out of the blue, that whole situation then, or?
We went to New Zealand, to Weta, to talk to Peter Jackson and the other Weta people for reference for costumes for developing the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, which we were writing. I was in charge of writing at the time. And basically, particularly the Perry, became really good friends with Peter Jackson. And while we were there, he said, "Would you like me to put you in as extras in the pickup scene that we are doing for Lord of the Rings, for Return of the King?" And we're like, "Oh yes." It's like, "Oh, you have to come back in 2 weeks." This is New Zealand, right? The Antipodes. And he was like, oh, we cannot stay another 2 weeks. We'll have to come back in another 2 weeks. And he goes, you're not coming back over here just for this. And we're like, yeah, no, we are. We definitely are.
The chance of fame, yeah, absolutely.
So we did.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, what a fantastic experience that was.
It was.
Yeah, and you know, that's not something that you can prepare for, really, is it, in any way, shape, or form when it comes out of the blue like that? Yeah, fantastic. So I'm not sure if Andy is ready. He's still off camera and muted at the moment, but we've. Yay! There we go. Fantastic.
Yeah, I've been here all along.
So we'll hand over to Andy now, and then at the end of Andy's bit, we'll bring Alessio back in and we'll do the Q&A. So don't forget, if you've got any questions, whack them in the Q&A. We've got a few in already, look, and we'll have a look at those after Andy's finished doing his piece, and we'll get the guys to answer some questions for you. Fantastic. Over to you, Andy.
All right. Well, for what it's worth, I don't think I'll be able to go for 40 minutes, one way or the other. I don't have a slide presentation or pictures of me next to a dead Mumak or anything like that. So it's all going to be a bit bland and downhill from here on in, frankly. My name's Andy Chambers. I worked at Games Workshop from 1990, as Alessio pointed out earlier. I was in with the bricks even when he showed up, through to 2004. So 14 years all told. I started out just writing White Dwarf articles. At the time, and this is going to be hard for you people to imagine, back then we didn't have the internet. So if you wanted to communicate stuff about hobbies, for example, or games, toy soldiers and things like that, you had to publish either a game, a book, or a magazine. And Games Workshop at the time had very wisely published, at that time for a little while, a monthly magazine called White Dwarf, which you may have heard of even to this day. And originally this was primarily a role-playing magazine, but over time, when Citadel Miniatures bought out Games Workshop, they morphed White Dwarf into basically a monthly advert for their products as much as anything else. And again, hard to imagine now, but back then the tabletop gaming scene was incredibly fractured. There were a number of different small manufacturers making miniatures ranges. There were a few sets of rules around. The two didn't necessarily tally up with each other very well. And this whole concept of like having a world and an intellectual property that you consistently built onto was kind of very scattered. It existed in certain corners, but it wasn't integrated in the same way that Games Workshop managed to pull together in the early 1990s. So with that background, I started out, basically I got my first job because I was a fan of one of their games, Adeptus Titanicus at the time, which again was a bit groundbreaking for its day because it was a game in a box. It had the rules and it had the miniatures and it even had dice in it, and all the bits you needed to play the game as a single package. And I'd got into that. I was a big fan of that. I also liked a rule book that they'd published separately called Rogue Trader, which was the first Warhammer 40,000 book. And I've been playing that for a while, and they'd had some new miniatures that had come out. You could see them in the store, but they didn't have any rules for them. And this, to my young brain at the time, was a dreadful situation. So I wrote an article for White Dwarf and submitted it, and they liked it enough to actually bring me in and get me to rewrite it, because this was lesson number one in exactly what Alessio was just talking about, communication and clients. I mean, I wasn't to know, but they had an idea of how they wanted to cover these new miniatures. They were knights, which you now even get in big scale in Warhammer 40,000. So I'd written an article, and it was good enough to pass muster, but it wasn't what they wanted. It wasn't the background that they wanted for it. So they got me in, and I rewrote it. And over the course of that, I started being given more articles to write, and picked up a job doing photography again. Oh my God, I'm so old. And this is plate photography, using nasty chemicals to develop pictures afterwards and so forth to put into the magazine, because nothing was digital then. Everything had to be physical layout and paste up and all that malark. I even actually able to paste up one of the Realm of Chaos books at the time. But nonetheless, it was a foot in the door. And from there, I kind of progressed on to being given supplements to write. Warhammer Battle Magic, I think was the first one I did, which was a selection of like additional material for the Warhammer game in the form of magic items and spells, and actually a whole magic system, which was card-based. And the system itself had been developed by Rick and various other people at the studio. But it fell to me to kind of like write it all up basically and turn it into cards and la. So that was another chunk of that. And from there, I got on to doing more supplements in the epic scale stuff to do with Adeptus Titanicus. That went through a new edition. And so everything needed updated, and we started doing like boxed supplements for that for the different armies that came out. And I did a series of those. From there, we got on to doing Warhammer 40,000 second edition, which took that earlier Rogue Trader rulebook and gave it the treatment of putting it in a box with miniatures and dice and cardboard terrain and all the rest of it as a single package, which was stunningly successful at the time, and was one of the things that really started to push Games Workshop up through the roof, and heralded a very busy time from there on in. Because, as Alessio alluded to, edition creep and edition control start to, if you work on any system over a period of time, they start to become your very first concerns, because there's always a pressure to update and improve, but there's always a counter pressure of sunk cost fallacy, basically, for all the people who've already invested in the game that you've sold them. And particularly when you're talking about tabletop games with miniatures involved, that's substantial. That extends to entire armies of miniatures, collected at the cost of hundreds, if not thousands of pounds. And you are suddenly in the hot seat as somebody who can invalidate lots of things by doing that. But at the same time, when you're accumulating new material in the form of like books of new rules, and even boxes of new rules, as we said, plus a monthly magazine with constant articles that are always squeezing out. And most importantly, from the Games Workshop perspective, was new miniatures coming out all the time, because that was with the lifeblood of the company. That was where they made their money, was in the miniatures. So constant churn, constant expansion. And you get this effect that's very much like a pyramid step, sort of resting on its point. It starts to tilt after a while. And sooner or later, you're going to need corrective surgery on it. Now, how far you go with that, as Alessio alluded to, is a very different question. I was actually around at Games Workshop for 3 editions of Warhammer 40,000. We did other games as well in between that, including like a space-based one, Battlefleet Gothic, kind of like Underhive, cyberpunky skirmish game called Necromunda. Sports games like Blood Bowl, all kinds of different stuff coming out all the time. So very rapidly moving environment for that sort of stuff, and a lot of pressure to make those big design changes. We made mistakes. I made mistakes in that time. The one I always cite to people, because it's a very sad case in many ways, is the epic scale stuff, what I talked about, what it extended from Adeptus Titanicus forward. We got to Titan Legions using the same system, basically, which was effectively 2nd edition Space Marine. So it was kind of 3rd generation from Adeptus Titanicus by that point. And we decided to, basically, one of the commercial reasons you do this is to reinvigorate what may be a slightly moribund part of your range and get sales going for it again. So we decided on a new edition. It was decided that there would be a new edition. And we did what we called Epic 40,000, which radically changed the way that things were handled from 2nd edition. As designers, it was myself and Jervis Johnson worked on it. We were very, very proud of what we produced, because it was a very, very slick game. It had extremely nice mechanics to it, and it played really, really well. However, the transition between those two systems effectively killed Epic, because enough of the gamers that were already invested in the Epic 2nd edition Space Marine rules didn't like it. They were not up for the change. So it actually tanked what had been, okay, it was a bit moribund, but it was still a going concern, and it effectively tanked that. And that was the death of Epic until recently when Games Workshop's done another Adeptus Titanicus game. They've actually come full circle now, which is something I applaud, actually, because that was what got me into it in the first place. So that was exciting times. So yeah, a sometimes harrowing decision to make when it comes to new edition choices. On the other hand, for example, with Warhammer 40,000 going from 2nd to 3rd edition was a similarly massive change in its own way, but it's actually a more successful one in that, yeah, some of the old school players didn't like it. They always will. Again, as Alessio alluded to, there's always going to be players that are unhappy with either how you're doing things now or how you do things in the future, which is an unfortunate reality. But what it did was actually open it up to a larger player base than it had before, because it made the game less complicated to learn in the first place. And that's something key that I'm going to return to, because what I want to talk about, sorry, I'll get onto the rest of my potted history in a minute, but to focus a little bit, what I want to talk about is more that kind of like meta shape of games design. Alessio's done a splendid job of talking you through the practicalities of working commercially with a client to try and produce the game that they want. I'm going to try and talk a bit more about how you shape what you bring to the table as the game's designer into all that, because at the end of the day, they are relying on your expertise. That's what they hired you for in the first place. So you need to be able to bring something to the table too, a way of thinking about things that's useful, so you're not just a scribe, basically. Anyway, 2004, spoke with Games Workshop. I did freelance work for a little while after that. I wrote a novel, and I did Starship Troopers, the tabletop miniatures game for Mongoose Publishing, which was absolutely hilarious. I'm a great fan of the movie, by the way, as terrible as it is. And after that, decided to make the jump across to working in digital gaming. I've become a big fan of digital gaming, particularly over the course of that year, if I'm honest. And it had been something that had always been, obviously, becoming more and more of a concern in some ways for the tabletop miniatures industry all the way through the 90s. But it was clearly a way forward. It was a different realm to game in, and I was really intrigued by it. So I managed to get a job at Blizzard, amazingly enough, with no experience in the industry whatsoever, but 14 years worth of background in writing and developing an intellectual property, which is a thing we didn't even have a word for when I was doing it. But by then, the concept of intellectual property is universes that you set your game or other supplemental material like books into, like your Marvel universe or what have you, had become germane. It had become important to some extent because of the existence of the internet by that time, because that communication of ideas, which is previously entirely bound to you either buying a game physically at your local store or having a magazine subscription or getting it from your news agent, now you could communicate with people all over the world. They could find each other, more importantly, and tell each other about things. So anyway, I got a job at Blizzard. I worked there as a creative director on StarCraft 2, specifically on the Wings of Liberty, for 4 years. I did a bit of work on WoW as well and StarCraft Ghost while I was there, and got a big heaving education in how both similar and how different video games are to work on compared to physical publishing tabletop games. And what I found, as I basically just alluded to, is that the knowledge base that you gain about how to handle creating worlds, creating IPs, merging things together between art and conceptual game mechanics, that works across both. It is the same. And that I'm pretty good at, even though I say it myself, because I've got a lot of experience in it, to some extent, a lot more than most people, because even at that point, when I joined Blizzard, I'd already been doing it for 14 years. And in the digital industry, at first, I thought things would change faster than it would for publishing, because you had this concept that you could update games pretty much any time you wanted. That's not how it is. It's actually a lot slower. You'll work on a single game for 4 or more years and maybe not see it get published in that time, compared to I was used to banging them out every year or two. On average, over my 30-year career, I've produced a game every other year, as well as other stuff. So it was interminably slow to me in some ways, but also incredibly fast in others. Because the truth of it is that the complexity involved in putting a video game together means that you have a much bigger crew, a much bigger team working on it. There's a lot more specialization, a lot more technical knowledge, obviously, is required. So actually coordinating such a large body of individuals is a challenge in itself. And to a large extent, digital studios are a lot more advanced than publishing studios when it comes to how to do that and how to manage the incredibly complex process that is involved in bringing a video game from first concept to actual delivery to the customer, the player, I should say, because they're not just customers. So that was an education, I can tell you. Also involved moving out to live in Southern California for that period of time. Coming out from that, I felt very uncertain about where to go. And what I've actually done in the intervening time since then is basically freelanced. And that has involved working for a variety of different digital companies and doing publishing in the conventional sense as well, and tabletop gaming, which kind of brings me back round to Warlord. I moved up and lived in Seattle for a couple of years doing that basically, and then moved back to the UK in 2011, whereupon I discovered Warlord had been doing quite well for themselves. They had Bolt Action out at the time, and that was doing splendidly. And it was basically peopled with a lot of the people I used to work with at Games Workshop. It comes around full circle to it's not what you know, it's who you know. So obviously I made connections with them, with Alessio specifically. He was kind enough to ask me in to write a supplement book for Bolt Action. So I did Armies of the Soviet Union, which has always been, he's kind of saved it for me because he knew that I was mad about Soviet Union, World War II Russians. So I wrote that for them and basically picked up doing bits and pieces. I've also, over the past few years, been working with a Finnish company that was set up by Thomas Pirinen, who also used to work at Games Workshop, based in Helsinki. And they worked on their own game, backing from NetEase, never actually went anywhere in the end, but it was cool. And they also did work with Next Games over at Helsinki as well. So I ended up doing stuff on like Fast and Furious and Blade Runner 2049 mobile games and stuff like that. Most recently, I did some work with Digital Extremes, doing, again, writing, background, world development, which is honestly where nobody wants me for a designer for a digital game, but they sure as hell do like my writing skills for it. So I guess if there's a lesson there to be learned, it's to don't dedicate yourself excessively to one element of what you're doing. It's a broad, holistic process. And to a large extent, what I learned at Games Workshop was to be the glue in that process. It was easier to learn there because basically you had miniature designers, you had artists, and then you had management over the top of you. And you were the glue that stuck it all together, basically. Took what the miniatures designers and what the artists were producing, wrote words to go around it, wrote rules to go around it, fitted it into the universe that you were building brick by brick. With every new release, every new article that goes into White Dwarf, every new book helps to build towards this greater whole, this larger universe that you're always trying to create. With some success there, because God bless him, Rick Priestley, when he first sort of laid out the groundwork for that universe, did something which would accept a lot of extra things being loaded onto it. And that brings me back around again to that concept of like, how open or closed is the environment that you're working within as a games developer? Because it might be entirely enclosed. You might be working on Fast and Furious, in which case you're dealing with cars, you're dealing with muscular men driving cars and nitrous oxide. There's no real escaping those boundaries at that point. You can throw in helicopters if you like, but it's always going to be a Fast and Furious game because that's what it should be. And nobody cares for you to put in elements that aren't to do with Fast and Furious in the Fast and Furious game. Seems obvious when you put it like that. But what Alessio was having to deal with in Bolt Action is something very, very different to that. He's again trying to build a system that will accept everything from the lowliest, greenest, most inexperienced troops going up against elites and tanks and artillery and aircraft and anti-aircraft and interacting with the terrain and all that sort of stuff. So he's having to build not just a singular game which deals with racing down the road a quarter mile at a time, but with building that kind of like universal concept of a game, just like I was talking about an IP being universal. Sometimes your rule system needs to be that as well, because what you're trying to create is a toolbox for adding more and more things to it, and it's got to be able to accept that and not break. But that comes at a cost. The game that you make, which revolves around using a single mechanic, is always going to be easier for the player to learn, to pick up on, and decide that he loves, than something that requires them to read a 128-page rule book. And as a games designer, you're always trying to balance between those two extremes. At one end is all the complexity you could ever want. And you as a games designer, you want it. That's why you got into this in the first place. At the other end is something that people will actually play in the most numbers. You'll lose some people from this end going to that end, and vice versa. And the numbers involved to a certain extent depends on the game that you're making. You know, what is the client? What are you making the game for? I tend to think of it in terms of a continuum from one end to the other. You've kind of got role-playing games, classic paper and pen role-playing games at the very extreme end of, like, at that point, you are literally giving tools to the players to make their own game with. That's the whole purpose of the game that you're doing. Obviously, it's going to be playable. It's going to have pleasing results. La, la, la. We can take that as read. But the question is how much control you're actually giving over to them. And that is a game that's designed to be 100% controllers in the player's hands. What their experience from there on in depends on them. It depends on their DM. It depends on their players. Your influence stops at them reading the rules. But at the other extreme ends, you've got games that revolve around a very simple mechanic. Hungry, Hungry Hippos. Tetris, something like that. And at that point, the game's users' experience, the player's experience, is really all on you, because you're the one that's leading this game. You're the one that's giving them mechanics to play with, and they have to be pleasing to them. So where you find the happy point for the particular game that you're making at the time is going to depend on what you're trying to achieve. What is the basis for it? What is the background to it? Because that's part of how it's sold. Or are you trying to sell a singular mechanic that is actually so blindingly brilliant, your hippos actually reach out and catch the balls, that you sell the entire game on that single concept alone, really, with the aid of some, you know, nice, useful bit of plastic injection molding in that particular case. A while ago, it took me many years to come to this conclusion. I came to understand that when we talk about games, we often use quite tactile terms. We'll talk about them being slick or smooth or having rough edges or sharp corners. And that kind of all extended from something that Jervis Johnson said to me decades before, when he talked about granularity in a game. Needed a bit more granularity, he felt. And I had to actually go, I don't understand that term. Can you explain it to me? And it's how gritty something is, how many little different pieces there are to it. And it made me start to come to the appreciation of the fact that actually granularity has its part to play in games. It helps players get a grip on them. So you can have a very smooth, slick experience at one end of the continuum, and you can have a very grabby, gritty experience at the other end of it. And as Alessio had alluded to in his talk, different players will be looking for different things as well. So your kind of catchment area for what kind of players you're going to get is going to depend on the mechanics you choose. What mechanics you should choose is, again, it's down to you as the designer. That's your call to make, depending on what you believe your player base to be like, what you believe your clients want. Here's a clue: it'll be the most players possible, please. But also the longevity of your game. Something that's slick and smooth, you don't hold on to it for very long. It slips out your fingers. Grippy things you can hang on to for longer. And that's the truth of the matter with something that's a very open architecture sort of game like Bolt Action. There's a lot of different elements you can bring in. Oh, look, we've done Hungarians, we've done Finns now, we've done Mongolian cavalry, that you couldn't get if it was a bare bones sort of a game. Like, for example, better example perhaps is Space Hulk at Games Workshop's perennial hunting aliens in Starship Corridors game, which has been around forever. It was already in production when I joined in 1990. It's been through several reprints since. Because what that game does is it hones down to a singular experience of heavily armored men with big guns hunting deadly aliens in an enclosed environment. A few times efforts have been made to try and expand it beyond that and make it into a game where you perhaps take lighter armored guys or you have different opponents, but they were never very successful, because what Space Hulk did, and did well, it did with such a limited set of parameters. One of the things that made it so approachable also meant that you couldn't really expand on it very successfully. That's okay. It's a board game. It can live in that space. And hence, it was a successful board game because it had good mechanics and it was simple to learn. And it actually acted as a tremendous gateway into the more complex Warhammer 40,000 games, because it introduced you to the universe that they existed in. It's like, this seems cool. And check it out. There's more of it. Because content is king at the end of the day. And that is another truism that's held throughout the last 30 years, is people always want more stuff. They want more content. It's easier to get it to them now, assuming you have the channels for it. And the thirst is always there. If you've got excited players, they're going to want more of it. Unless you're making one of those one-off games, in which case they're going to want another game, please, of similar slick and marvelous mechanics that they fall in love with it at first time, first pass. So where do we go from there? When you're making those open architecture games, I mentioned this before, that you're coordinating. I mean, it used to be for me between miniature designers and artists. With a digital game, it's just artists in effect and modelers, which kind of comes to much the same place. But one of the things that you're trying to do over the course of creating a game is establish a visual language which helps and supports the kind of game rules that you're imposing on that universe. So big guns do more damage, sort of a thing. And that is one of the tools, again, as a designer, you can bring to the table, because artists are wacky. They'll produce all kinds of different things. But it does help if you can give them some direction. If you can say these guys are light and fast and deadly, they'll go, and they'll produce something that actually has visual keys towards that. I have a visual aid for this, actually. Let's see if we can do that. There we go. You see that? This is from a test that was first carried out in the 1920s. Two shapes, Kiki and Boo Boo. Can you tell which one's which? I bet you can, or at least you think you can, because actually, when tested, 95% of people think Kiki is the spiky one, of course. Interestingly, that's not even just for English speakers either. They tested it on Tamil speakers, and they got the same results. And it's one of those things where it actually crosses across language barriers as well, that we know that the spiky one is Kiki. And that's something which applies in games. Not so much, obviously, in the historical games. You have historical precedent to work off from there. But anytime you're moving to the sci-fi or fantasy realms, then you will need to establish that same sort of visual language, which helps support and lends your game. And here's a word that I love very much, $25 word, this, verisimilitude, the appearance of truth. With the appearance of truth, your warriors or what have you will support the idea that they are light and fast and deadly, as opposed to heavily armored and can stay against all threats and so forth and so forth. And that is something that the visual guide of what the artists are doing, what the modelers are doing, can 100% sell for you if you let them know that's what's supposed to be happening. And that comes back again to communication. That's why sometimes you'll play a game and you'll go like, these guys don't quite feel right for what they look like or what have you, or that cutscene didn't make any sense in relation to gameplay. Lack of communication. Because it's very easy to go off into corners and do your own thing. What we do for a living is quite solo and isolating by definition, so you have to work hard. I've been sitting here thinking that I've not been communicating enough with my clients, having listened to Alessio, and he's quite right. You have to work hard to keep those communications open at all times. There should never be any surprises. There shouldn't be no big reveals either. Your natural inclination will be to go down that route. It was one of the things they actually taught us specifically at Blizzard to avoid, because they've had their fingers burnt on so many occasions by it. Oh, I'll show you that cutscene next week. Oh, I just need another week on it. Oh, it should be ready at the end of the month. And then 3 months down the line, you've got a cutscene that's just got nothing to do with the game that you're playing. Easily done. Very easily done. And it's part of your job to make sure it doesn't happen. And to be a pain in the ass about it, to be honest. Talking about visual language, here's another thing I created. Look at that. It took me minutes. This is something I developed over the course of working at Games Workshop to help explain visual language to artists and to miniatures designers. I never put it in quite these bold terms. I might hasten to add, I was always a lot more circumspect about it. But there is a truism in it. You look at those three shapes, you consider which one's the attacky one, which one's the all-rounder. Bit of a giveaway there, you know. Which one's the stodgy one, the one with numbers. In terms of 40K, this applied to Eldar, Space Marine, and Orcs, of course. And if you look at the miniatures, you'll see they're actually kind of those shapes. There's a reason for that. It's because we're establishing a visual language with them. If you want to get really meta about it, though, and consider those shapes and their relationships to each other, it also tells you about how they play in the game. Specialized, pointy, big, blocky, vulnerable flanks, all-round tough. And that's basically what we try to make those particular factions play like in Warhammer 40,000. Two things support each other. I'm gonna steal a look at my notes here. Yep, I think we're about there, basically. Yep, that's me running out of material. So we can go to Q&A now. Quickly.
Q&A. That was great. I love that shape thing. That was brilliant. I was sat there thinking the orcs were the square, but I couldn't work out the other two. I couldn't work out which one was which. So
yeah, pointy hats for the Eldar. That's the
absolutely, yeah. Interestingly, I didn't realise that you and I have a connection because we both started working for Games Workshop in 1990. So there you go.
Oh, crazy.
In completely different places, but well, I was in Eastwood. You would have been presumably in the design studio then, which was...
Well, technically, I first worked for Games Workshop, I think it was in 1986, because I worked in mail order in Eastwood.
Excellent. That's
what I did a few months, and then it was just like for the Christmas season. And I quit, came back the following Christmas and did a few months then, and then quit again. So, yeah, I'd done my time in mail order.
Yeah, I think
being a troll.
Standard practice for most people then, wasn't it? I did a bit in mail order as well with Ted the troll.
Well, it kind of became a thing, actually. Yeah, when particularly when Games Workshop started getting bigger, when we recruited people, they go and spend some time in mail order just to, learn the basics and have some... And again, remember, no internet. So you got some basic customer interaction at that point, because people would write in with their specific, I want this specific miniature and that specific miniature to go find them. And it kind of grounded you to a large extent in what you were doing and who you were dealing with. So we did actually adopt that as a policy where people had to do their time in mail order.
Yeah, it was great.
And in stores as well.
Yeah, I can remember people coming in the stores as well. My favourite experience in mail order was being the guy that sent the white dwarfs out to the subscribers.
Oh yeah.
Which was like really annoying because you had to put them all in envelopes at the time. Because again, everything was manual.
Yes.
But the most exciting thing was I posted Terry Pratchett's White Dwarf every month for a few months while I was doing that job, and that made it very exciting. So I was quite happy about that. Okay, so we've got some questions for the Q&A. Tex, could you bring the Q&A just up on my screen so I can see them? Beautiful, thank you very much. And welcome back, Alessio, as well.
It was great to listen to that, actually. The Kiki and Booba thing was well, wow, of course.
Shall I let you in on a
Really?
secret? I learned that from a video game. It's actually in Persona 5, where I kid you not, you play as like high school kids going to school, by day and fighting demons by night, sort of thing. You and your talking cat, and you actually have school lessons and you have exams as well. I might hasten to add, where they test you on it.
Wow.
And that was one of the things they taught me in this school lesson in Persona 5. So, yeah, learned that in Shibuya.
Andy's suddenly got massive kudos from our students because loads of them love Persona 5. It's one of their favourite games. The amount of times it comes up in discussions in class.
We shouldn't get onto that. I've just finished Strikers, and that was really good as well.
Somebody did actually make a comment when you were doing that bit about Kirby. Apparently they chose Kirby, the name Kirby, because it was a harsh-sounding name, but Kirby, the character, was a soft character, squidgy kind of character, and apparently it was a deliberate move to choose the name Kirby as it was a harsh sounding name with the K. So there you go.
To make it memorable because it contrasted. Interesting.
Yeah. It is kind of like a juxtaposition as well because the character's pink and strange as well, isn't it? So it's quite an interesting one. Yeah, we've got loads of students commenting and saying they love Persona 5 now. Look.
Well, educational. You learn things from it. Yes. That is honestly, that's where I got the Kiki Booby thing from. And I thought, wow, that is really interesting. And you can look it up. It's on Wikipedia. And they can tell you about the test they did. And I say, basically, it works on everybody except blind people.
You'd think they might make a feel version of it, though, where you could feel the shapes.
No, apparently, if they're born blind, even if they feel them, they don't.
Oh, interesting.
Differentiate. Wow. Yeah, apparently it has some implications about how we see the seizure and how we see the world, how we perceive the world in general. Something as simple as that. So it's really fascinating. Dead short on Wikipedia as well. You can go and look it up. That's where I got the picture from.
Brilliant. Great. See, we've all learned something today. If we take one thing away,
school day.
We've learned that. Yeah. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of questions here. I'm going to try and wade through them. Obviously, we've got quite a long time, so we should be okay. So this is a really good question. I think this is probably one definitely both of you will have had experience with because you've both worked for big companies, not just Games Workshop, other companies as well. Do you think the expectations of those companies and the publishers of the games get in the way of your creativity in some way? Is it difficult to work like that? And is that partly why freelance is more appealing, I guess, is the root of that question?
I'll take that one first, if you like, Alessio. Yes, absolutely. They will 100% get in the way with your creativity as a games designer. Part of your job as a games designer is to learn to suck that up if you want to work with the big boys, basically. And I don't mean to be harsh, but the other thing I should say to you all is no one is interested in your good ideas. They want you to do a job that you got hired for, which is to make the game that they want. And that's the sad reality of it. It's also a splendidly good discipline as well. The clients that scare me the most are the ones that say we could do anything. Because what that means is they either don't know what they want to do at all, or they do know what they want to do and they don't know how to communicate it to you. And you will get to find out somewhere further down the track what it is that they actually want through the unpleasant process of elimination, basically. You can counteract that to a certain extent in the early stages by doing things like offering several different proposals. We could do this as a 6mm game. We could do this as a 28mm game. We could do this as whatever. Different ways of doing things and so on and so forth. But generally, you're not going to be in those straits because most people kind of have an idea of what they want. And it's usually like something they've seen before. where you go from there and how much originality you inject onto it is going to be dependent on the client to a large extent and what their expectations are. Some have got a really tight idea of what they want. Some don't. Some you can win over to your way of thinking about it. Some you can't. And in that case, again, it's your job to find a way around that. But it's also within all this, also your job to do something that you know is good and you're proud of. And that can be a difficult course at times. But I say that's the trade that you're in. I'm sure Alessio can back me up on that.
Sure. Yeah. The only thing I would add is ideas are relatively easy to come about. There's a lot of people with ideas that will fire you ideas. What's difficult is not having the ideas, it's turning ideas into product. That's the really, really difficult thing. You get to appreciate it after years of, like fantastic, throwing a lot of ideas in a brainstorming and talking a lot is easy. Summoning this thing, choosing the right one and driving it through energy, work, application, diplomacy, a lot of diplomacy. Andy, you know exactly the old difficult customer that, they hire you and then you give them your feedback based on your experience because they hired the expert, i.e. the person that's made all possible mistakes in the field, so now he's an expert. and you go, right, I'm an expert, you hired me, and now I recommend you to do this, and they ignore you, and they go and do something completely different, and again, and again, and again, and you kind of go, this is like me hiring an electrician to wire up my house, and then going, I think you should change, now use these other cables, put the blue wire there and the red one. It's like, your house will burn down. No, don't worry about it. But I know your house will burn down. So diplomacy is important, and driving the many ideas into feasible, doable things, and focusing all that energy that is required to actually bring an idea into a product. That's the difficult part. That's the really difficult part. That would be.
Does that put pressure on? I mean, you're both, you've got good pedigree, the pair of you. You've designed games for a very long time, and you've both got lots of experience. Does that put more pressure on you, in terms of being able to deliver things as well? Do people's expectations, because you've had successful games in the past, do people's expectations change for you?
I have to say, not really. You put that pressure on yourself as a designer that everything should be better than the last thing you designed. Of course it should. You need to show progress to yourself as much as anything else. But as I alluded to, that's not always what your clients and your customers are looking for. So to a certain extent, you have to sort of school yourself on that front, or save it for the things that are genuinely, within your purview to do that with. For example, I've got a tabletop game published through Warlord Blood Red Skies, which is a World War II fighter combat game. Warlord never asked for a World War II fighter combat game. It was something I developed myself years ago, over years. But I actually felt as a designer, it's probably one of the best designs I've ever made.
It's a great game. Yeah, it really is. And
it's really slick,
It is, yeah, it's slick. Exactly, yeah.
So I basically hung on to that one and kept it back for myself until I found a way to publish it. And I showed it to Warlord, and they were like, oh, this is really cool, but we can't do it right now. Because they were doing Gates of Antares or something, I think, at the time. So I went off, and it was a couple more years. And then they were in a position where they wanted to do something with it. And that was very much having to sort of bide its time and wait. I did consider doing a Kickstarter for it and all that sort of stuff, but never really liked the smell of that too much. We are trying to do a Kickstarter for a digital edition of Blood Red Skies at the moment, which, much as I'd feared, it's a bit too niche, and I don't think it's going to fund, basically. World War II air combat. I like it a lot. There's some other people that really like it a lot as well, but not that many of us, I don't think. But kind of enough to support a miniatures game, at least.
Well, there's 100 students almost in the session now, so go support Andy's Kickstarter. There you go. Right, so let's have a look at some more questions. Oh, this ties in nicely. What themes would you like to explore with future projects? You've probably got future projects on the go, but are there any themes that you haven't explored yet that you really would like? You know, that you're thinking, wow, that would make a really good game.
I have one that I've been thinking about, and it's mainly because I've always eschewed a couple of game mechanics specifically ever since I've started doing games professionally. Actually, I've kind of actively fought against them and tried to eliminate them wherever possible in games. One of those is pre-plotted movement, having orders for your movement. The other one is vector movement, like Newtonian physics, which was big in spaceship games in the 70s and 80s, because that's how it really works in space. So basically, if you jet in one direction for a while, you need to turn around and like hammer on the afterburners to even slow down. And those two concepts, both of which are dreadfully monstrous, just like you have no control over your battle at all. As I used to play in games back in the 80s, no, 70s. It's like, and now in my dotage, in my old age, I actually want to try and write a game that uses both of them so I can actually like exercise that demon, really. Because there are successful pre-plotted movement games out there. There are less successful vector movement games out there as well. And it's a challenge. It's something that I haven't done before. And that's one of my things I'll probably never get to do. Although, if I'm honest, The Expanse is popular these days, and that's got real Newtonian physics in its combat. So there's potentially an IP to apply that kind of thinking to that's popular, and that helps, obviously.
Yeah. Alessio, what about you?
I was thinking that one war game that I always wanted to do and never quite got around to doing, and even though the ideas have been written down and it's like, well, at some stage you might make it. It's something to do with dexterity skills, literally physical dexterity, you know, like crossbow and catapult, things like where it starts with the A.G. Wells Little Wars, where actually, you know, when you determine which soldiers are dead by firing matchsticks at them and stuff, and when the one
it's a bit ableist, isn't it?
The core mechanics being, if he falls over, it's dead, and make it into a proper war game with, you know, with core rules and a proper set of tools that work, all with this principle of knock it down, is dead. And you know, we did ponder Kickstartering, stuff like that. There's been ideas and development done with it, and one of the main considerations is actually safety. Because you fire things at things where you're actually very low looking at them, on the other end your opponent looking at them.
The old adage, you could have someone's eye out. Yes.
Goggles are recommended for this.
It comes with goggles in the game. Yeah.
That's why the rocket firing Boba Fett was withdrawn, isn't it? Because there was a hoo-ha about that at the time. Brilliant. I mean, did you? This sort of leads into another question about innovation as well. I mean, I think you both really been involved in games that have had innovative elements in them. And do you think that's important in design? You know, Alessio touched on it a little bit with the bolt action thing about the dice, for example. And I know one of the things that I've always found that was fantastic in games was when the Lord of the Rings game came out and you had the priority tokens and things like that in there. That kind of changed the gameplay. Those kind of things are really innovative. Do you think they're important in game design, or can you make a game that's quite derivative and not that innovative but works as a formula?
I wouldn't think they are completely necessary in the sense that you can make a game that is very innovative but doesn't use any new technology or new elements like that. On the other end, of course, commercially, it's unique. So you're always after that unique selling point. You know, the USP. What's the USP of this game, kind of thing. So, for example, I mean, there at Confetti, we've done the one example of searching that new edge was the Alexa, the smart speaker games we were doing when we came there, and there's still one active at the moment, which is the Void Warper space adventure, choose your own adventure on Alexa kind of thing. So that was an example of trying something new, well, something old in a new technology, rather. And I mean, now we're trying to use the smart speakers in interacting with our board game. So actually, the next board game we're doing is coming out soon. It has an Alexa. It has cards in there that are activated by Alexa. So you read that card, Alexa will respond and expand and give you random materials. So you're effectively, you have an infinite amount of things that you can then add to the thing, to your board game, by actually just changing the scripts in the Alexa, in the smart speaker. So new technology, cool, but I wouldn't think it's completely necessary, Andy. I don't know. What do you think?
I think Alessio makes a very good point. It's always a good selling point to have something that you can hang your hat off in terms of a unique mechanic, not just something that's derivative. But it's not essential either. Sometimes it's not even really looked for. Again, this is the warning story about don't design a game that nobody's asked for. But that being said, yeah, it's always good to have a hook of some description. It comes back to finding the hook which gives you that kind of that verisimilitude, again, that feeling of truth. Case of example, the hook for Blood Red Skies, it's an aerial combat game. It's to do with, in essence, altitudes. But it's got a cunning way of handling altitudes, which translates into energy states. So you can be advantaged or neutral or disadvantaged. And if you know much about air war, that really makes a lot of sense. I've had high praise from, Marine Corps air crew and stuff like that about how much sense it makes if you know how to fly a plane. But it's a very simple mechanic, and it's the one thing that you hang your hat off for that particular game. The other mechanics that surround it are very, very straightforward. Just roll your dice pool systems, because you don't need any more innovation than that, really. You've got your piece of innovation there. There's another slightly canny mechanic in there as well, but you don't need a lot of them. Most of the stuff that you need to run through, just like rolling dice and so forth, it's as old as the hills, really. How you flavor it is up to you. There are a few, particularly with dice mechanics, I feel there are drawbacks to trying to do modified dice mechanics. It's one of the reasons I like to use dice pools these days. But like bolt action, for example, does use dice modifiers. You have a roll to hit. You get minuses if the target's in cover, and so on and so forth. That's a very standard war games mechanic. No one's going to have a problem with it. Everyone understands how that works. I think it only becomes really a problem if you have too many modifiers. I have a rule of thumb that people can't remember more than 6 things easily. So best make it 3, and then they can remember it easily. Yeah. That applies to modifiers and stuff like that as well. So, but yeah, at that point you're cooking rather than baking, if you understand. You take ingredients and you add them in different proportions to make your game. The ingredients are all well known. How you mix them together is what makes your game special. Yeah. You don't necessarily need unique ingredients for that. One experience I've had, because it's every day's a school day, is I have the great privilege to work on the 2000 AD games recently for Warlord Games. They've got the license to produce Judge Dredd, for example, and Strontium Dog, are 2 games we've done so far. We've got a new one coming out for Slain soon, which is a fantasy hero. And they're quite well-known properties. They've been established over 40 years in the case of Dredd. And trying to get something that feels right for those games is a journey in its own right. So we did Strontium Dog first because it's out of the same comic. There's a certain amount of crossover. Sometimes the characters actually do cross over between the 2 games as a test bed for what we wanted to do as a universal system that we would use for all of the 2000 AD games, with the understanding we'd modify it a bit for each game as it required. And it was so well received over the course of doing Strontium Dog to Judge Dredd, because they are basically the same game. We just did produce different stats for different characters in them, and some different cards and so on as well. So the card play is a bit different. I'd originally been considering doing Slain very differently because it was fantasy. But I ended up trying to make it as similar as possible, because people actually value that ability to transition from one game to the other with as few barriers as possible. And if they were a fan of one thing in 2008, it's a good chance they were fans of other things in 2080. So actually, that becomes a selling point, where it is like, if you know this game already, you can just plug straight into the new ones that come out because, hey, it's all 2000 AD games. So that kind of universality, which is something that, again, we kind of had that with Warhammer 40,000, that it was a core rule system that we could actually plug across into doing very, very diverse armies. That's a merit in itself, a unique feature in some ways of its own. It does come with a cost. You've always got balance implications. The more flexible your rule system becomes, the more liable it is to break, basically, especially if you hand it over to the players and say, hey, I play with this, they'll break it just on principle. So that's the other end from the Hungry Hippos end. The only way you break Hungry Hippos is by hammering on your hippo too hard. You can't actually change the game mechanics. But with something like a role-playing game or bolt action or Strontium Dog or Judge Dredd, the game mechanics are basically presented to the player to a lot of extent, so they can mess around with them, break them if they feel like it.
What we need next is the ABC Warriors, Andy. I'm just saying, ABC Warriors.
I couldn't possibly comment because I've been told not to.
That would be amazing. That kind of leads on nicely to another question, actually. And you touched on it a little bit in your talk, Andy, when you talked about games development and how originally it was Adeptus Titanicus that kind of got you into to the development thing, and obviously they've just revisited that. Do you think that nostalgia is a big factor at the moment in terms of driving games? Because I think it's really interesting that, you know, we've got Adeptus Titanicus again, we've got Necromunda being done recently again, we've got Blood Bowl being done recently again, you know, and a lot of the games that Games Workshop said they would never go back to have been redone again now. And I guess there is a generation of people who now have disposable income and want that nostalgia thing. And I think perhaps the 2000 AD thing probably feeds into that a little bit as well. How do you feel about that?
I think it's undoubtedly true. Games, the customer base that I deal with has definitely grown older as I've grown older. And, you know, new ones have come in at the bottom. But in many cases, they're the kids, literally the kids of the people that were reading my White Dwarf articles or what have you over 20 years ago, to put it into perspective. So it is a bit of a generational thing. But there is a lot of nostalgia involved, but it can also be a trap as well to get too nostalgic about things. You do need to reboot things on occasion. You do need to like blow them out bigger on occasion. And sometimes you'll lose part of the nostalgia crew along the way. But you can't be entirely rooted in that because they're going to die off or drift away or what have you. They won't generally get bigger. They'll get smaller over time. So while nostalgia is powerful and a very useful tool to have, you need to, again, this is one of your jobs, you need to manage that transition to the new and the good and the great fairly regularly, because otherwise you're going to wither away and die over time, no matter. Or to be fair, you accept that you're dealing with a niche. You go, fine, we have our niche. We charge, you know, through the nose for our products, relatively speaking, because to the people who want to collect them, it is worth it to them. And you see that kind of spiraling market happen. I mean, collectible card games is a fantastic example of this in some ways, where it constantly renews, constantly updates, but there's also a constant market based around the imposed rarity of certain features for that game. And that doesn't go away over time. What it does is actually accumulates more as the few examples that are available can be snapped up and the price goes up and up. And that's a kind of a different model where nostalgia, collectability is built in to the actual core product. Not something that me or Alessio have a great deal of experience with because it's primarily an American and Japanese phenomenon, but it is real and it has had an effect, a ripple effect out into other places in the industry over time.
Yeah, I think there's parallels in the video games industry, definitely. You always get collector's editions now of the games, don't you, that always cost an arm and a leg and that really aren't that
Collector's
great,
editions
you
are
know?
kind of everything now. First, you know, books tend to come out and so on. They'll do a first edition, hardback first. And if you really want it, you can pay for that. And then later they'll think about doing a softback book version of it, omnibus after that, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's actually fairly regulated these days as a way to like squeeze as much money out of the process as possible. it works well for the customer, for the player, for the end user, whoever you want to talk about, because at the end of the day, they're going to get something that's been honed up and say like, oh, here's a really nice edition. Here's your, leather-bound slip case and all the rest of it, embossed with gold, and you get something lovely for your shelf, not something that's been knocked out as cheap as possible. Yeah. So it has got benefits too.
What's your feelings on nostalgia games, Alessio?
I was thinking that nostalgia can be dangerous in the sense that sometimes when you go back to something that you remember fondly and you look back at something that you haven't looked at for a long time, but you remember it fondly, and then you look at it and you go, actually, this is not that good. I'm sure we all had that experience. It's like, because your taste have moved on, you have developed, you have changed, and so that memory is better left, untouched, because as long as it's fuzzy in the past, you remember it well, and then you discover this game and go, actually, this game or this type of games is not great. I had a great memory of it, but or an IP indeed. Nostalgia is something that we definitely have used a lot. We are using a lot in terms of IPs, as in a lot of, if you look at the product range of River Horses, it's like we're stuck in the 80s, really. We have this, Highlander, Labyrinth, is a Dark Crystal. So it's all very, very 80s, because I guess, again, that's where my nostalgia tends to be, is like that. So.
But I think there is a big target market from that period as well, isn't there? I think that's the other thing. It's a cool thing. The 80s, like you mentioned, Stranger Things, for example, earlier on, and I think that's obviously got that link, that kind of nostalgic feel for everybody when we watch it. So yeah, I think it's valid. Now then, so here's a sort of interesting one, which ties into nostalgia. I try and make the questions sort of roll off each other. So this is sort of anti-nostalgia, really. Somebody's asked what your opinion on the transition from Warhammer Fantasy to Age of Sigmar is. It's quite a controversial thing still, I think, even now. It's a few years on from the big explosion of the old world. Have you got any feelings? Because you worked in those worlds, and created a lot of the lore that goes with those worlds, and now it's all gone, effectively, hasn't it? So.
Well, I mean, from a commercial point of view, I think it was interesting, a dangerous, brave choice, I guess, which seems to have paid off ultimately. And the Games Workshop seemed to be doing fairly well recently. So it was not the wrong commercial choice. In terms of, it certainly must have lost a branch of customers, and several companies have tried to fill that niche. I mean, there's quite a few companies that have gone, right, mass rank battle game, fantasy game, let's go there and try to grab that territory, while it still, has been abandoned by the market leader. And so that I mean, I work with quite a few of these companies that have tried to do that. Whether somebody's going to achieve that, or Games Workshop is going to go back and go, right, now we're doing all dammer, so we're going to grab that territory back as well. We'll see. But in terms of IP development, I mean, Andy, you did more of the development of the actual IP there. How did it feel on your side?
From my perspective, yeah, as someone who's had to work in different intellectual properties, I was horrified that they took that step. I think it was a misstep. I think it was a massive misstep, personally, because they've effectively cut off, 20, 30 years worth of development in their fantasy universe, and trade it in for what exactly? Nothing is what they got out of it. They're kind of rebuilding now, as I understand it, and things are looking up a little bit. But I really don't understand what the thinking was that managed to push that all the way through, frankly. I mean, Warhammer had always struggled a little bit. Warhammer 40,000, tended to take in more money than Warhammer did, it's true. But the idea that in the process of basically trying to reboot it and do a new edition, they should destroy everything that had gone before, pointedly, write novels about it, and actively destroy their universe is just, it blows my mind. Stupid is what I call it. I can understand the need for the reboot. People. I can understand the need for the reboot, absolutely. Like I say, Warhammer was struggling because mass rank games are a hard sell when miniatures start getting expensive, and they always depended on that. So that move over to what they're doing now with Age of Sigmar needed to happen, but I don't think they needed to trash their old IP to do it. A big part of Warhammer from the very outset was the Realms of Chaos. And right there, you've got everything that Age of Sigmar gives you in the Realm of Chaos. Yep. You don't need to destroy everything outside the Realm of Chaos to make that work. All you've got to do is shift emphasis. And I cannot understand why they didn't simply do that. But there you go. A bold choice, as Alessio said.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we've seen anything like it in the industry, have we?
There's a reason for that. Because basically they've poisoned their own well at this point. And it's been hilarious. I'm a great fan of the Total War games and Total Warhammer in particular, which is just like chef's kiss levels of, I love it. Do you play, Alessio? Have you ever played Total Warhammer? Yeah. It's just brilliant, man. It's everything you could want from a Warhammer game. There on PC. Beautiful. The campaigns and economy. Oh, just everything. And they've been going great guns. I mean, Creative Assembly is now, the third one is about to come out in not a terribly long period of time. It must be said either. They've been cranking at it and doing DLC all the way through. They're doing really well out of it. And that, to me, is just proof positive of how influential and important actually that IP is to Games Workshop. And it's not just Total War either. You got Vermintide and the Mordheim game and all this other stuff, which all kind of spun out into the digital world from the original Warhammer game. And to then go back and just like go, oh, I don't want it, crack. It's just crazy as far as I'm concerned.
There's another industry example of that process, very similar, that actually backfired and they went back on it, which I'm thinking D&D. So when they went 3.5 successful game system, they're like 4. A few years later, like no 5, which is a bit like 3.5. 4, no. There's 4, no.
Things have gone terribly wrong. Yes.
So well done.
Well, I've been reading about this recently. Actually, Chris Pramas on Facebook is a fantastic series of Facebook posts he's been doing over the entire period of lockdown, which he calls Curated Quarantine, which talks about D&D in part of it, because he worked at Wizards of the Coast through that period as well. And he's, basically each day he'll bring up a role-playing product or a set of rules or a game and talk about it and talk about the history of how it was made and the people who made it and so on and when it came out. And, this is stuff from the 70s sometimes and stuff like that. It's fascinating stuff. Anyway, point about D&D is they made a bold decision when they did 3rd edition D&D to have an open game license for it under the D20 system, in that basically it was okay for other people to make products for their game. There was a tacit sort of like, that's all right, we won't sue you. Because wisely, they discovered this thing where it was easy enough to make the main game books and sell them to people, but creating modules and supplements and things like that, Wizards of the Coast weren't really agile enough to manage that process very successfully. So they had this idea. There were, however, lots of little role-playing game companies all the time, because you don't need many people to write role-playing game material. One guy and an artist can do it, basically, and somebody to do layout, which is often one of those two guys. So team size is very small. So the open game license would allow anybody to come to the well, as it were, and basically expand their overall product, push D&D upwards in general. Marvelous stuff. It kind of got out of their control, was the problem. And eventually they needed to drag it back in-house, which is what spawned 4th edition D&D as being a very different take, broke with all the sort of like what had happened for 3rd edition, created Paizo by accident and the whole Pathfinder thing to take up the reins of 3.5 that they left behind, and actually generated a competitor for themselves in the same process. And as he's rightly pointed out, and now here we are at 5th edition, basically going back to, it's not really 3rd, but it sort of is. It's actually really good 5th edition, to be fair. They did their homework.
It's massively successful. I mean, it's gone to a scale that never was before. It's just huge.
Well, when we talk about nostalgia, D&D is like the big daddy of nostalgia, really, because it was one of the first. When I started out being little nipper Andy in the 70s, fantasy as a concept was like Sinbad films. That was fantasy, you know. Jason and the Argonauts. That was what fantasy was. There wasn't, and you know, all reading Lord of the Rings, but there wasn't any cohesive sort of like fantasy games around. Particularly, you get like one shots here and there all the time. So, yeah, that idea of actually taking an IP and pushing forward with it and generating a world, D&D actually broached that for a lot of people as a role-playing game that they could get into and be a part of and play the game, not just sort of like play a board game, or you know, a board game based on a novel generally was one of the primary sorts of fantasy you'd see at the time. So it kind of gave the tools to the players in a way, and that spawned an awful lot of interest. It's hard again for us to imagine these days what an impact that had on the scene in general. But D&D as a property, it wasn't designed as a commercial property in the first place, and it wasn't easy to make money out of, because you know, you sold people a couple of books and then they were off on their own. So where's the money come from?
Miniatures.
To keep you designing books? Yeah, miniatures. That's where the money comes from.
It's interesting. I find with the students particularly, there's tons of students in the last couple of years that have got into D&D, and you know, at one point I think it was probably Industry Week like 3 years ago when we did the first one at Metronome. We did a D&D session for the whole day when we do the Games Expo. That literally they ran for the sort of like 12-hour D&D session, and there was just a group of students quite happily playing D&D for the whole day. And I think at one point we had 3 D&D groups in the college, all oblivious of each other, all running independently, but they're absolutely mad on it. It's you know, there'll be ones in now out of these 90 odd students that we've got in. You know, they'll be mad D&D players. And it's great to see that, because for me, as with Andy, I mean, that was my entry level really into gaming, D&D. When I first started playing games, it was D&D that I played, and I'm sure, you know, a lot of us came into the hobby through that, really. Yeah.
And the open license thing is back with 5, with a vengeance. I mean, there's a lot of stuff made on 5, isn't it? On different IPs. I mean, that's a very recent phenomenon, isn't it? I'll take the license for Lord of the Rings and use, you know, open license D&D rules. I'll take the license for this, that, and just do that, which is big. I mean, probably helping making it the monster it is now in terms of size.
Yeah, tremendous recognizability. D&D, absolutely huge, but yet difficult to capitalize on at the same time. It's a really, really odd one. Interesting subject.
Also quite complex as well, you know, in terms of what we were talking about earlier on when you said about the rules and things like that. You know, to actually be a good D&D player, you need to digest the rules and understand things, don't you?
From playing quite a lot recently, I think they're doing a fantastic job of actually monetizing, as in the D&D Beyond support stuff they're doing. The fact that you have now, basically, we don't have paper. It's not a Dyson paper game anymore. I'm playing with people in Italy,
right?
Because of the Zoom thing, but that support the Beyond thing, it gives you character sheets that you are virtual. They're in the cloud. You have this face. And both the rules, the modules, the dice that you roll during the session, the ability of playing together with other players online. And obviously, there's like, oh, you can have all of this for free. And then you go, oh, but if you want access to that particular bit, oh, you can buy this other bit with a discount. And frankly, it's very, very easy to just go, oh, this is some bit. Oh, I want that bit. Oh, yeah, I have a subscription. There's a subscription level where you can be the master levels. So I think that
season pass. Yeah,
they brought a lot of know-how from the video game industry, from the casual gaming, you know, monetization strategies into and basically use D&D as a gel for it. And frankly, again, I've personally experienced working on my own skin, on my own wallet. It's a thing that definitely, you know, it's like, they got it now. Yes. It's like, here's some digital money for some virtual goods that don't really exist, but I can have them.
I suppose COVID's been a factor in it as well, you know. Because
it's undoubtedly accelerated things a lot over this past year. You know, there were various movements in this direction starting to happen, but I think this last year has actually made people go to those things and use them in a way that I've not seen before.
Bolt Action's on Tabletop Simulator, isn't it? You can play Bolt Action on there.
And Blood Red Skies.
Yeah, and Blood Red Skies, yeah. So it's fascinating. And I think now, if you're a new games designer, maybe that's where you'd be looking as well. We just did a session just before this one with Stone Sword, who are a relatively new company. They've done the Hogs of War games based on the old PS1 games. They've done a miniature game and a card game based on that. Both fantastic games. If you haven't seen them, check them out. They're great. And their stuff's going on to Tabletop Simulator more or less at the same time as it's coming out in real life at the moment, because it's accessible to people and they can use it. So I've got a good question here from Ethan. What's the best way to bring players of more simple games into the more complicated, complex games? So I guess, people play board games as family board games, don't they? And they probably enjoy playing a good board game or tabletop type game. How do we convert those from sort of casual board game players to more dyed-in-the-wool type war gamers stroke tabletop gamers?
Yeah, well, that is ever the question, really. Part of it comes back to that gradation that I was talking about earlier on, and which in turn feeds into that old saw that all game designers use at some point, which is, easy to learn, difficult to master, which is having a game which actually has enough dimension to it that you can't learn how to win too easily. There are extra complexities that are involved in that don't necessarily intrude on you when you first start playing it, but kind of like reveal themselves over time as you get to know the game better. And like, some of this depends on the sort of like diversity of the pieces that you're trying to get into it as well. So one of the reasons that I liked Blood Skies enough to keep touting it around was it was actually tremendously easy to teach people it. Everyone can get their head around the, daka, get on somebody's tail, shoot them up sort of concept, easy concept to get across. The mechanics communicated it pretty simply. But actually, there's a lot more to it once you take a little bit of a step back and start looking, at the overall tactics of trying to manage an air fight as opposed to a single aircraft. And that was one of the objectives I had for the game in the first place, was trying to move things up a rank so that you weren't using pre-plotted movement to handle 2 or 3 planes at most at a time. Because when I'd read about historical engagements and the biographies of ace pilots and stuff like that, that wasn't what most of their air combat experiences were like. They might cite a specific example like that, but there were lots more examples when there's like 30 or 40 opposing aircraft in the sky at the same time, all trying to shoot the hell out of each other, basically. And that was more what I was interested in doing than the, very World War One Immelmans and all the rest of it sort of approach to gaming that I'd seen for all air combat games before that.
Do you think it's easier when you've got like a historical based game like that for people to latch on to that kind of thing? So obviously with Blood Red Skies, there's going to be an expectation of what that game's about. I suppose to a certain extent with things like Victory at Sea as well, that Bolt Action Warlord have done recently, because we have kind of an expectation of how aeroplanes move, how boats move.
It's not just limited to historical games. It's absolutely true of historical games, yes. And one of the first pleasures that you get with working on a historical game is to run into people that really, really, really do know a lot about them, and will point out the fact that you've, got the penetration wrong on this particular tank gun or something like that. But it also applies to fantasy and science fiction as well. Is Superman harder than Batman? This is a real thing that gets debated at length between fans.
Yes.
And,
we all know
buts, and so on and so forth. So you are stepping into a realm where there's an established sort of like verisimilitude, this sense of truth already there. And you'll get that whenever you're dealing with an established IP, not just a historical one. With a historical one, it's easier to get down to like raw data and actually look at the, the tests that were done by the military at the time, which tell you what the tank cannon penetration was, than to find out exactly how fast Superman can burn through steel with his I-beams. But blessings of the internet, you can probably find someone who's tried to work it out somewhere now. I know they did it with turbo lasers for Star Wars Star Destroyers.
Well, my reply to that question, the thing that went through my head, but I don't know whether I'm allowed to say that, maybe a bit controversial. So, is how do you turn the the people that like simple games for the community, the more mainstream people into the people that like the more complex games, etc. My answer would, the thing that went from my head was, why would you? Why would you want to do that? In the sense that obviously the people that like the simpler games, the family games that you're describing, etc., are far greater in numbers than the people that like the very niche, very super complex games. So
I could answer that for you, Alessio. It's because the people who are deeply into your games will spend more money than the people who aren't that deeply into your game. If you're looking at it in terms of, to a large extent, what Riverhorse does, where you do a Labyrinth game or a Terminator game and you sell them that game and then you're done, yeah, there's absolutely no point whatsoever. You're quite right. But in the context of something like the Games Workshop raft of different games, it is useful to have a simpler feeder game, which will then draw people into getting into the universe as a whole and then invest further. And then potentially you've got them for decades, spending thousands upon thousands on your products rather than for this one-off game. And then you have to do that whole process again next time you publish a game. And that's the payoff that you get for actually managing to transition people from simpler game mechanics onto more complex ones. And that's, I think, what I'd answer is, you have simpler games available, which will kind of like prime people for your universe, show them the IP and the artwork and the wonderful miniatures or the great game mechanics or what have you, but in a simpler sort of bite-sized form than the necessary full enchilada. They can get into that later.
Which is interesting, because that is kind of the path that Games Workshop have taken recently, isn't it? And obviously they've become more successful as a result of that. You know, we've got those kind of like Rise of the Orcs board games that they do, the little tiny box ones.
One of the big complaints I had with Games Workshop in the late 90s through to when I left was the fact they decided to just focus in on doing 3 games.
Yeah.
Just doing Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 and Lord of the Rings as it was then, because I felt that was a critical mistake, really. That all of those other games that we did, Necromunda and Gorka Morka and Battlefleet Gothic, all help to draw other people in. And once you've got them in, then you can start selling them the rest of your vast universe sort of thing. But you've got to get them in the first place.
And it is showing the scope of the universe as well. I think that's the other thing about those specialist games. And, you know, Games Workshop do it, but other companies do it as well. I'm thinking, you know, Privateer Press with War Machine to a certain extent do it.
It's everyone attempts it. Yeah. Everyone attempts it. They really do, because that's, in the long term, when you're running a company and trying to produce constant product, that's where the long-term money is with your long-term fans.
So you both had successes with film licenses. Labyrinth, obviously, Dark Crystal, and you with your Starship Troopers, which was, I love that game. I think it's a great game. Is it more difficult when you're working with something like that is very established in terms of the look and the feel and the way that things work? You know, I guess with Starship Troopers, because there was a film and it existed and you kind of saw how those creatures behaved, when you're actually designing the game, does that make it more limited, or does that give you that creative freedom?
It lights the way. This was my experience of it. It kind of lights the way of where you want to go with it. From the outset, and like I say, you want some of those parameters put on you, really ideally, in games design. We can go anywhere, we can do anything is useless. One of the first things you need to do is start working out what your scope is and what your limitations are going to be. So when you work with an IP, some of that's already been done for you, in effect, by the existing materials. So the first thing you do is look at that and go, okay, how do we now apply that to a game? So it's actually answering one of your first questions. That's my experience anyway. Alessio's probably got a different perspective on it.
I mean, it is limiting, because if nothing else, there is a party that needs to approve your game. As in, that's the main factor, is that there's a layer on top of anything you do, that when you don't have an IP, you're not licensing an IP, where you can do pretty much what you want, to actually having an extra check. There is the licensor that will have to look at your thing or your product and go, no, you can't do that, or yes. So there is certainly more control. That's what you pay for the audience, for the, you know, the fact that you know already there is an audience that will share the love, the passion for that IP, and so you already have somebody you're talking to directly with your rules, with your product, with your games, with your miniatures. You already have that, but of course you have to accept that you cannot do what you want. That's part of the game, isn't it? It's part of the process.
So we've got some questions about your games as well. So what's the most challenging project you've worked on? And then conversely, what's been the project that you've enjoyed working on the most?
Okay. Well, to just continue exactly what I was saying, one that was very challenging from that point of view was the Hunger Games game we made, because Jennifer Lawrence agents were fairly strict with this is the miniature of Katniss, and this was like, oh no, you that bit and all that bit, oh that is a little bit of the lips. So you go, you realize this is this big, right? Just see this coin next to it. It's like to give you, because nobody's going to see the details you're talking about. Is that moment, which we had with Lord of the Rings as well, but I think with this one in particular, maybe because it's not a very gamey IP, so the people that own the IP and the author herself, I mean, she maybe they're not familiar with the gaming world and side requirements, and so the whole concept was a bit alien to them, and it was very difficult. While actually maybe you were talking to somebody that there's many games made for Lord of the Rings, the people that hold the IP are more familiar with where people go with this kind of stuff. So yeah, it was a challenging set of approval process there to go through to get those approved. That was entertaining. In terms of what game I enjoyed the most, well, I guess probably goes again with Lord of the Rings for me. You showed those pictures when during my talk, and that brought a Tolkien fan like me into living a dream. So I guess that was probably the moment being on set designing a game for that was magical.
Okay, for me, most challenging, Gorka Morka was my Cross the Rubicon most challenging game.
I love Gorka Morka. It's one of my favourite games.
A lot of people say that, actually. It's surprisingly popular. Basically, because thanks to management shenanigans, it got handed down to me to create it in like 8 weeks. From one of those classic, I'll next week, okay, start of next month kind of scenarios, with Rick doing the kind of like the core mechanic, because he had like a boost mechanic, which was the core mechanic because the vehicles were involved. And basically he drops it onto me 8 weeks before it had to go to the printers. So I had 8 weeks of thrashing like crazy through Gorka Morka to write the damn thing, and to more or less copy and paste lots of Necromunda off to it, and then change bionic legs with a K and stuff like that. And to get a bit creative with it as well, to be fair. I did have fun with it while I was doing it too, but oh God, cranking something out in that kind of, and I've never felt entirely comfortable with it because it was done so quickly. I mean, it's nice. People have enjoyed it, and they still enjoy it, apparently. But
I think it had a lot of charm, but I think
it was terrifying.
Interesting that they've never revisited it. That's the thing for me with Gorka Morka. There's
a bit too niche. Orcs.
Yeah.
People love orcs if they love orcs, but if they don't, then there was nothing there for them.
Yeah.
Necromunda's an interesting contrast, because with the 6 different gangs that it launched with, there was a look and a style for everybody in there somewhere, by design. It's Jez Goodwin doing his "I'm a good designer" thing again there. So it was actually easier for people to get into, because they're like, oh yeah, I like the look of those guys, and so on. But with Gorka Morka, it's like, do you like orcs? Yes,
not,
no.
Move along. Yeah.
If not, go away. I mean, we did a few extra things on it with supplement. We did like gobbos, basically grots.
Gobbos, yeah.
Well, and humans as well, and weird muties. So there was a little bit more diversity in it, but fundamentally it was like orcs. Do you like orcs?
Yeah. What's the thing you're most proud of, Andy, that you've done?
That's a split, actually, between Battlefleet Gothic, which I produced while I was still at Games Workshop, which was the one game that I produced while I was at Games Workshop that wasn't kind of to a brief from management. I did that off my own back, and then basically harassed them until they gave in, and Rick gave in, because we were going to stop doing quite so many games, because we were going to focus on 3 games. So he gave me my druthers and allowed me to do it, and that was great. I had a fantastic time doing that game. It turned out beautifully, everything I could ever want out of a game. It was great fun working with Gav on it as well, in particular, Gav Thorpe. So that was kind of like what I considered my high point at Games Workshop, was doing Battlefield Gothic. Bit niche again, but I like it. I like spaceships. So outside of that, Blood Red Skies probably hits that mark as well. Again, as something that I've actually initiated and signed entirely off my own back. So, and I'm very proud of the way that's turned out.
I'm really happy with Blood Red Skies that they included the Johnny Reb or Johnny Red character in there as an add-on pack. That was very exciting when that came out. How do you feel about the Battlefleet Gothic video game? Do you think? I mean, I was quite impressed with it because I think it did have some of the flavour, but it didn't quite get it right for me.
I've only, to my embarrassment, I've only played a little bit of the first one. I haven't played the second one at all. The first one, I felt like they gave in to that desire to put in fiddly bits, if you know what I mean. It had a bit too much granularity to it, because Battlefleet Gothic is quite a granular game already, and they obviously coming at it from a video game point of view, and they're not entirely wrong either, I must hasten to add. But it seemed to load up too fast, too early on those complexities. So some of it might have just been how they led into them, I don't know. But I kind of bounced off it a little bit. And if that's me bouncing off it, then I can't help but feel they missed the mark a little bit with that first one. I hear the second one's better. I hear the mobile game's very good as well, actually.
Yeah, the mobile one is good. I do like that one, yeah. Okay, so... oh, interesting. Well, this kind of ties in with the COVID situation, I think. Ethan's asked quite a few questions. I'm going to join these two together. So he's asking how do we think that COVID's going to change the games industry? And also tied into that, I suppose, do we think that electronic versions of tabletop games will become more popular kind of as a side effect of COVID at the moment? Because that's kind of how it is at the moment, but I guess it's going to change again when things open up. Maybe there might be a resurgence of people who are desperate to, play games again, just like they're desperate to go and have a drink in the pub. It could work the other way, couldn't it? Yeah.
It's hard to speculate, really. Very difficult on that front. Yes, I've definitely heard that said by people, is that they are really keen to be able to get together and start playing games again. On the other hand, will it make a permanent mark as towards people getting together in general? It's really hard to say. I mean, here in the UK, we're getting vaccinated quite fast. Our vaccination rate's quite high. So I can actually see things more or less returning to normal eventually. We've always felt down the years that electronic versions of tabletop games didn't have much legs, but that's been kind of proved wrong a few times now. So I do think there'll be an expansion of it. Every experience I've had of this in the past, though, has been that it doesn't cannibalize the existing game very much. It just gives people more opportunity to play. So to the good, I think.
Yeah, sitting alongside it is probably true. It maybe makes it available, allows people to try them. Maybe it's easier to try bolt action on a tabletop simulator and just go. You don't have to collect anything. You just need a mate that goes, right, try this. And so, once maybe you like that experience, maybe you can get into this. So possibly wider audience, easier to share, easier to try, I guess. But yeah, I entirely agree. Making predictions is just, is easy gonna go away? I hope so. If it does, then yes, in-person gaming should come back with a vengeance. I personally cannot wait to go and play some bolt action on a tournament. One of those, days out to play bolt action a lot in a big room full of people. But, is it gonna be back to that? I hope so.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I one thing I should also note when we talk about electronic games to physical games is like a lot of what drives the tabletop industry. We laughed a few times about how miniatures is where the money is, because actually it's about the physical collection practice that motivates a lot of people. The games provide them with a vehicle and a reason and a shape for doing it, but they like collecting and painting miniatures. That's why they do it. They would do it even if there wasn't a game. It actually, what it does is it enables, to a certain extent, them to find good reasons for collecting more stuff. That's why we do it. That's why they buy more stuff. So that hasn't gone away over the course of even this year. People have carried on buying products, painting armies, and collecting miniatures with undiminished ferocity from what I've seen. Increased, if anything.
I was about to say, I think it's probably increased, yeah. Because what people have had is a little bit of extra time to do that stuff, which they wouldn't normally have. So yeah, it's very interesting, unless you're a teacher, of course.
Unless you do board games as well, because board games, unlike things where there's a lot of hobby involved, require people to get together to play physical board games.
So we've got again a question slightly related to what we just discussed, but just pushing it in another direction. So we talked about electronic games, and I guess things like Tabletop Simulator fall under that. What about VR? Because I suppose that's another thing that's still developing. It seems like VR's been developing for centuries now. It's. I remember when I was at art college, we were looking at VR, and that was like 30 years ago. So it's kind of constantly evolving VR, and I think it is getting to the point now where we are able to maybe look at virtual representations of board games in VR. But do you think there's a future in that, or is it because we need that tactile thing that Andy's just talked about then as well?
Go for it. Go for it, Alessio.
I was thinking one thing that I've seen a lot of in wargaming is not quite VR but AR. They all augmented reality. It's like you're looking at your wargame table through these mobile phone glasses, whatever is the digital tool, and then you get stats, you get effects, you get measures. So there is a lot of these attempts of trying to augment your traditional wargame experience with. We looked at it with the smart speakers, but other people look at it from a point your phone at this, look at the game table through that. In my personal experience and my opinion, I haven't seen anything yet that made me go, "Oh, that improves the experience." Maybe I'm old-fashioned like that, but at the moment I haven't felt that. I felt this actually makes it more difficult. Can almost create another barrier in there.
Yeah.
Will they get there? I don't know. Have you seen anything, Andy?
This was a lively topic of discussion with the Finns over a long period of time about VR and whether it would go anywhere. First of all, what you addressed about the sort of AR approach. Yeah, really, we've been seeing this for a long time now. People going like, "Aha! We have the technology now. We can create, an augmented reality board game, and you don't even need miniatures. You can just see it through your glasses." It's not really what anybody wants. From my experience, it's never really taken off or gone very far. The closest you got is a few board games use apps or smart speakers, and you get a certain amount out of that. But then it also comes with a concern about longer term support as well. Like, is this going to work on my next iPhone or what have you? Which produces a tail to it, which is a bit as well. In terms of VR, in the broader sense of literal big goggles on your head, it's made some ground, but nowhere near as much as the money that's been put into trying to develop it by the major hardware producers over decades at this point. So again, I think it's running into a problem of it's not really what most people want. They don't particularly want to sit there in their own living room with a big pair of goggles on their head. It's amazing. I absolutely love it. And it's a fantastic experience, but it's also an exhausting experience as well, I've found in playing it. And that's not necessarily what people are playing a game for. They're not playing a game to be exhausted. They're generally, looking for a bit of intellectual stimulation and fun. So I don't know that VR's going to make it until we get onto the technology level where it's literally glasses like this, where it's less of a hassle. For certain things, it's just unbeatable. For air combat games, for example, there is just nothing quite like doing it in VR as compared to doing it on a flat screen. So it's got a niche. It's certainly got a niche. Whether it goes to real, genuinely, mass appeal, I'm still not sure about that. I don't think it will, because like I say, I don't get a sense that it's actually what people are generally looking for. It's an experience, certainly, but it's not an experience you necessarily want to repeat all that often. Yeah, it's a funny one.
I think
it has
again it
side
might be.
effects.
Yeah, and yeah, side effects definitely. Yeah, I think it might be interesting to see how VR is perceived after COVID as well, because I think in a way, because of the way the world's changed now, the appeal of VR is slightly diminished because we've been living in this strange virtual reality where we've
Yes.
been looking at people
I want things
not
I
in
can
real
touch
life.
and feel.
I want tactile things now, not virtual things. And yeah, I think society's possibly changed. So I think as we move out of this, it will be interesting to see how things change, and maybe physical things will become more popular as people crave that experience again. So without getting too deep and philosophical about
That
it.
being said, and just to give the counterpoint towards this, there is an element with smartphones which I think is going to transition inevitably into our field in particular. It's not stabilized quite enough yet, but we're starting to get there. And you see it a lot with army builders and stuff like that now, where there's a general expectation. I don't know if expectation is the right word for it. There's a want for things like army builders, that so you can just like fiddle around with your army list on your phone and stuff like that. And I can see that coming more to the fore. It's not really the augmented reality like Alessio was talking about. It's actually just a convenient facility for something you do anyway. And
Yeah,
I
it's
can
almost
see
like
that.
a tracking thing, isn't it? When you're using one of those things, it runs alongside the game, and you can track things on there, which I suppose feeds into what Alessio was saying about the D&D Beyond thing.
The Beyond thing, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, that kind of an augmentation where it's just a more convenient way of accessing information, having stuff pulled up for you. I can see that continuing to have some legs. Again, it's a niche. It's not necessarily a mass thing, but I think it will become increasingly important as we go forward.
Yeah, and I think certainly for the students, that's something that it could be worth thinking about for the future as well, in terms of what they're doing, especially the ones who are more techie and more into programming. Those sort of areas are where there might be opportunities as well. So we've nearly done Q&A now. We're nearly at the end. I'm gonna. We've got some questions about inspiration. So what inspires you? Not necessarily in games either, I guess, at this point. That could be just anything, couldn't it? Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah, make it even broader, because that'll make it easier.
Cool
What
IP.
inspires me?
Cool IPs, I guess, for me, I guess, is the being a user first, being a player, being a person that watches films and series, books, comics, something that gets you excited there. And obviously, as a designer, my first reaction would be, "Oh, this will make a nice game." Is that like Andy was saying? I think the most important thing is the IP, is the story. That what brings you in. Then, of course, rules and product that are cool and fit and keep you in. But I think that the main inspiration and the drive is that I love this story. I want to live more into this world. I want to stay in this world. For me, it would be that. A cool story is where it starts from.
Yeah, I'd have to concur. Really, more than anything else. What inspires me? Things like 2000 AD that inspired me when I was young still inspire me now. Good movies. Good movies often hit all the right notes when they're well done. Other good games are often an inspiration for why you might want to design something that's a bit like that, but does, Malburians instead of Napoleonics or whatever. So inspiration can come from all kinds of different places, really. But yeah, first off, it's something that's within you. You're the one who finds your own inspiration. So you're inspired by what you're inspired by, really. That might be another designer in some cases, I guess. You can be inspired by me if you like. I don't really advise it, though. But I've certainly been, I'm joking around, but I've been inspired by authors before now, and the worlds they've created and the way they've written about them to try and create games that either evoke the same feeling or recreate some elements of the combat, things like that. History is a huge, huge source of inspiration all on its own. If you don't know your history, you don't know nothing, basically, because everything's happened before. But in a variety of exciting ways. Sorry, say again?
And it's happening again.
And it's happening again.
Cases.
History is cyclic, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's also unique and amazing and surprising and wild. So history is always a huge inspiration too. like I say, for Blood Red Skies specifically, I was literally inspired by getting into flying World War II planes in an online combat game, which was a simulator. So I had to learn how to fly a plane, in effect. And after learning how to fly a plane, you had to learn how to fight a plane, which is not the same thing. And over the course of that, as Alessio was saying, you sort of like go like, oh, this could make a game in its own right, couldn't it? Yeah. Oh wow. Yeah, I think I could see how I'd do it. So that kind of thing, your inspiration can come from all sorts of different places.
Fantastic. I've had loads out of this today. It's been really great for me. Hopefully the students have enjoyed it too. I think it's that time where the students can share their gratitude and say thank you in the chat. Hopefully you guys have got the chat up and can see the comments, but they'll give some claps. It's kind of normally there'd be a round of applause, but you'll get people typing the word clap.
I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Which is always a bit strange, in my opinion. Yeah. But there we go. I've really enjoyed the talk today. I've been looking forward to it all week. I think that historical thing is a great note to end on as well, especially with the Warlord Games connection today and the Warlord takeover, because one of the things I love about Warlord Games, and John in particular, John is so passionate about history anyway, but the fact is that those games do introduce history to people who wouldn't necessarily be into history as well. And I think, you know, if one of the students today goes away and buys Blood Red Skies and learns about World War II aircraft as a result of that, that's fantastic. And I know I have got loads of students who really are into history already. Sean asked a question about Victory at Sea that I haven't asked, but that's only because I don't think you'll know the answer to it because you haven't worked on that project. So, but yeah, the fact that Warlord do these fantastic historical based games, and it's almost like a gateway into history for a lot of people that play them. So beautiful stuff. Thank you both for taking part today. It's been, as I say, very entertaining and very informative for us. If nothing else, we're going to take away those two blobby and spiky shapes, which is great. I urge you to just stay on, Andy and Alessio, at the end, because we'll kick all the students out and then we'll just have a quick chat at the end, a debrief type thing. I just got a plug tomorrow as well, of course, because tomorrow we've got possibly the biggest guest that we've ever had at Industry Week, I think, it's in the games department, so I'm very happy about it. We've got John Romero, designer of Doom, Quake, and Wolfenstein, all awesome games, doing a talk for us in this time tomorrow afternoon with his wife Brenda, who's also a gaming personality. So that's going to be very exciting for everybody. I'll see you there at that one. That's the only one I'm doing tomorrow. So take care, students. I will see you later. Andy and Alessio, if you can just hang around. We'll go back to the holding slide and some music, and then I'll come back to you in a few minutes when we've kicked everyone out. Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk today. It's a great pleasure for me.